Burning at the stake was not about simple execution. If all you wanted was to kill someone, there were faster, cheaper ways. A sword, an axe, a rope. These were common. But burning was different. It was a ceremony. It was a statement. It was a tool of absolute power, both spiritual and earthly. And to understand it, you have to understand the medieval mind, where the soul was more real than the body, and heresy was the most dangerous crime of all. Heresy was seen as a disease, not just a simple illness, but a plague of the soul. A person who held beliefs contrary to the established church was not just wrong. They were infected, and like any plague, it could spread. Their words could contaminate their neighbors. Their ideas could poison a whole town. The church saw itself as the guardian of all Christian souls, and its duty was to protect the flock from this spiritual sickness. An execution was not just punishment for the individual, it was a form of public sanitation. It was cutting out the cancer before it could metastasize. Fire was the chosen instrument because of its symbolism. Fire was seen as a cleansing force, a purifying agent. In a world steeped in religious metaphor, this was everything. The flames that consumed the heretic's body were thought to purify the community of their sin. It was a terrible public act of cauterization. The smoke rising to the sky was a signal to God that the earthly authorities were doing their job, rooting out corruption and defending the faith. For the condemned, it offered a perverse kind of hope. Some theologians argued that the intense pain of the fire could, in its final moments, purge the sinner's soul, allowing them to enter heaven. It was a horrible, agonizing penance, but a penance nonetheless. This was the logic, a way to frame immense cruelty as an act of mercy. But there was another, more practical reason for using fire. It was about total annihilation. A beheaded man leaves a body. A hanged man leaves a corpse. These bodies could be buried, and their graves could become shrines. The followers of a heretic might secretly dig up the body and take bones as holy relics. It would keep the disease of their ideas alive. It would move them in a martyr and a focal point. Fire solved this problem completely. It left nothing behind. The body was reduced to ash and charred bone fragments. There was no corpse to bury, no grave to visit, no relics to venerate. The authorities would often collect the ashes and scatter them in a river, ensuring that not a single trace of the person remained on the earth. It was the ultimate erasure. They were not just killed, they were unmade. This punishment was also a spectacle. Executions were not hidden away in prisons. They were public performances, often held in the main town square on a market day when the largest crowds would be present. The state and the church worked together. The church would condemn the person for their spiritual crimes, and the state would carry out the sentence. This public display of unity showed everyone who was in charge. It was a brutal lesson. The sight of a person screaming in the flames, the smell of burning flesh, the sheer horror of it all was meant to be unforgettable. It was a warning burned into the collective memory of the community. See what happens when you challenge us. See what happens when you step outside the bounds of acceptable thought. The fear it generated was a powerful tool for social control. It kept people in line, afraid to even voice dissenting opinions, lest they end up on the pyre themselves. So while the official reason was about saving souls and purifying the community, the unofficial one was about maintaining power through absolute terror. The journey to the stake rarely began with a dramatic confrontation. It started quietly. It might begin with a whispered accusation from a neighbor who held a grudge, or it could be a comment made in a tavern, overheard and reported. Sometimes it came from a formal denunciation to the local priest or bishop. In the height of the Inquisition, investigators would travel from town to town, actively seeking out signs of heresy. They would offer a period of grace where people could come forward and confess their sins or accuse others. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion. Friend turned against friend, and family members informed on each other. Once a person was accused, their life was effectively over. They would be arrested and taken to a prison, often run by the church. These were not modern jails, they were dungeons. Cold, dark, damp cells, sometimes underground, filled with filth and vermin. The prisoner was held in isolation, cut off from their family and any legal help. The goal was to break them down, to make them feel hopeless and alone. Food was minimal, just enough to keep them alive for the next stage. The psychological torment of this solitary confinement was often as effective as any physical torture. The next stage was interrogation. This was not a process of discovering the truth. It was a process of extracting a confession. The inquisitors believed they already knew the truth. The accused was guilty. The trial was simply a way to get the heretic to admit their sin, repent, and accept the church's authority. The accused was not told who had accused them or what the specific charges were. They were simply told to confess their heresy. They had no right to a lawyer in the modern sense. Any lawyer brave enough to defend an accused heretic risked being accused of heresy themselves. The entire system was designed to produce a guilty verdict. If the prisoner refused to confess, torture was employed. The church had a rule ecclesia non satit sanguinem, meaning the church does not thirst for blood. This created a legal loophole. The inquisitors, as men of God, would not perform the torture themselves. They would turn the prisoner over to the secular authorities to do the questioning, and then the prisoner would be brought back. The methods were scientifically designed to inflict maximum pain without necessarily killing the person. There was the rack, a wooden frame where the victim's limbs were slowly pulled from their sockets. There was the strappato, where the hands were tied behind the back and the person was hoisted into the air by their wrists, often dislocating their shoulders. Water torture, which simulated drowning, was also common. Instruments were used to crush thumbs, fingers, and toes. Under this agony, most people would confess to anything. They would admit to worshipping the devil, to performing black magic, to holding whatever heretical beliefs the inquisitors suggested. And they would often name others, creating a chain reaction of accusations and arrests. Once a confession was obtained, the trial was largely a formality. The inquisitors would present their evidence, which was the confession they had extracted through torture. The accused might be given a chance to recant, but this was a dangerous move. A heretic who confessed and repented might be given a lesser sentence, like life in prison. A heretic who refused to confess or who recanted their confession was deemed relapsed and unrepentant. This was a death sentence. The final act was the sentencing. This took place at a public ceremony called an auto de fe, or act of faith. It was a long, elaborate ritual. The condemned were paraded through the streets wearing special garments called a San Benito. This was a yellow tunic, often decorated with flames and demons to publicly mark their sin. They might also wear a tall, conical hat. A great procession of priests, nobles, and officials would march to the town square. A sermon would be preached, and the sentences would be read aloud for all to hear. Here again, the church used its legal fiction. The church itself would not sentence anyone to death. Instead, they would relax the condemned to the secular arm. This meant they were formally handed over to the state authorities with a plea for mercy and that no blood be shed. It was a cynical charade. Everyone knew that no blood be shed was a code for burning at the stake. From there, the condemned were led out of the town to the place of execution, their final journey to the pyre. The place of execution was usually just outside the city walls, in a field or a large public square. It had to be big enough to accommodate the crowds that would gather. This was a major event, and people would come from miles around to watch. Or vendors might sell food and drink. It had the grim atmosphere of a festival. In the center of this space stood the stake. It was a thick, heavy wooden post set deep into the ground. Around its base, the pyre was built. The construction of the pyre was a craft. It was not just a random pile of wood. It was carefully layered to ensure it would burn in a specific way. At the bottom, there would be larger logs to create a stable, long-burning base. On top of that, smaller, drier pieces of wood and kindling, like bundles of sticks or straw, were placed. These were meant to catch fire quickly and create a massive blaze. The choice of wood mattered. For dry, seasoned wood would burn hot and fast, potentially leading to a quicker death from smoke inhalation. For green, unseasoned wood was sometimes used intentionally. It would smolder and produce a lot of smoke but less flame, prolonging the agony of the victim as they were essentially slow-cooked rather than burned. The goal was not just death, but suffering. The condemned person was led to the stake. Their hands were often tied behind their back. They were forced onto a small platform or stool and then chained or tied securely to the post. They needed to be high enough for the whole crowd to see them clearly. A priest would often be present, urging them to make a final confession and repent. Some victims would pray silently. Some would cry out their innocence. Others, broken by months of torture and despair, were eerily silent. In some cases, a small measure of mercy might be granted, depending on the victim's social status, or if they had fully cooperated and repented. One form of this was the bag of gunpowder. A small pouch filled with gunpowder would be hung around the victim's neck. The hope was that when the flames reached it, the explosion would kill them instantly, or at least render them unconscious. It did not always work as planned. Another, more common act of mercy was strangulation. The executioner might pass a rope or a chain, known as a garrote, around the person's neck. Just before the pyre was lit, or as the flames began to rise, the executioner would tighten it from behind the stake, strangling the person to death. From the crowd's perspective, it would look as if they were being burned alive, preserving the spectacle while shortening the actual suffering. This was a privilege, not a right, and it was denied to those deemed most defiant. Then, the fire was lit. Torches were brought and applied to the kindling at several points around the base of the pyre. The dry material would catch quickly, and a wall of flame and thick, acrid smoke would erupt upwards. The first thing to hit the victim was the smoke. Inhaling the superheated air and carbon monoxide would sear the lungs and quickly lead to asphyxiation. For many, this was the actual cause of death, and it was perhaps the luckiest way to go. They would lose consciousness from lack of oxygen before the worst of the burn set in. But if the wind was blowing the wrong way or if the fire was built to burn slowly, the victim would remain conscious as the flames reached their body. The pain is unimaginable. The fire would burn away clothing, then skin, then fat. The nerve endings would scream in agony before being destroyed. The body would convulse, the muscles contracting violently in the heat. The smell was horrific. The odor of burning hair and cooking flesh would fill the air and carry across the crowd. The sounds were just as bad. The crackling of the fire was punctuated by the shrieks and moans of the dying person. What witnesses at the time wrote about these sounds, the final, inhuman cries of those in the fire. Death would come from a combination of factors: suffocation from the smoke, shock from the immense pain and fluid loss, or the direct destruction of vital organs by the heat. It was an agonizing, slow process that could take anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour, depending on the fire and the conditions. The executioner might use a long pole to push burning logs closer to the body or to move the victim's limbs back into the fire if they thrashed away from the stake. Even after the person was clearly dead, the fire was kept burning. It had to be hot enough and last long enough to consume the body completely. The goal was total destruction. After the flames finally died down, what was left was a pile of ash and blackened, brittle bones. And the executioner and his assistants would go through the remains using rakes and poles to break up the larger bone fragments. They had to make sure nothing identifiable was left. Sometimes the heart or other organs would not burn completely and would have to be thrown back into a renewed fire. When only ash and dust remained, it was shoveled into a cart. The final act was to take this cart to the nearest river and dump the contents into the water, letting the current wash away the last physical traces of the person who had been erased from existence. The image of burning at the stake is often tied to a single idea, the witch, but the reality is that many different kinds of people were sent to the pyre. The crime that most often warranted this punishment, especially in the High Middle Ages, was heresy. Heresy was the act of holding a belief that directly contradicted the established doctrine of the Catholic Church. And there were many such movements. One of the most famous groups targeted were the Cathars of southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Cathars had a dualist belief system. They believed that the physical world was evil, created by a lesser malevolent god, while the spiritual world was good, created by the true God. They rejected the authority of the Pope, the sacraments of the Church, and the idea that Jesus was physically present on earth. They were essentially a rival Christian faith. To the Church, this was an existential threat. A crusade was launched against them, and the Inquisition was established largely to root them out. These Cathars who were captured and refused to renounce their faith were burned en masse. In 1244, at the fortress of Montségur, over 200 Cathar leaders were burned in a single, massive pyre. Later, figures like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia challenged church practices. Wycliffe argued that the Bible, not the church hierarchy, was the ultimate source of religious authority. Well, he died of a stroke, but decades after his death, the church was so infuriated by his continuing influence that they had his body dug up, burned his bones, and scattered the ashes in a river. His follower, John Hus, was not so lucky. He was promised safe conduct to the Council of Constance to defend his ideas, but the promise was broken. He was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1415. His death turned him into a national hero and martyr in Bohemia. And then there were the witches. While accusations of witchcraft existed throughout the Middle Ages, the great witch hunts came a bit later, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries, a time of great religious and social upheaval. But the groundwork was laid in the medieval period. The belief was that a witch was not just someone who used folk magic and it was usually as she had made a pact with the devil, renouncing God in exchange for supernatural powers. This made witchcraft the ultimate form of heresy. The publication of the book Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, in 1487, acted as a guidebook for witch hunters, detailing how to identify, prosecute, and punish witches. Witch burning was the prescribed execution because it was believed to destroy the witch's evil magical power along with their body. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of things like flying at night, consorting with demons, and causing crops to fail or children to sicken. They were tortured until they confessed, and were then burned in public squares across Europe. The charge of heresy was also a convenient political weapon. If a powerful person wanted to get rid of an enemy, accusing them of heresy was an effective way to do it. The church's legal machinery would do the dirty work, and the accuser's hands would appear clean. The most famous example of this is Joan of Arc. She was a French military leader who led the army against the English. When she was captured by English allied forces in 1430, they could not simply execute her as a soldier. She was a symbol of French resistance. So they put her on trial for heresy. They accused her of witchcraft for hearing divine voices and of heresy for dressing in men's clothing. After a long politically motivated trial, she was found guilty. She was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen in 1431. Her crime was not theological, it was political. Heresy was just the legal justification. Other groups were targeted too. Jews were often scapegoated during times of crisis, like the Black Death. They were accused of poisoning wells or desecrating the Eucharist. These accusations often led to pogroms where entire Jewish communities were massacred. Burning was sometimes the method used. Men accused of sodomy, a term that covered a range of non-procreative sexual acts, could also be burned at the stake. This was seen as a sin against nature and God, a form of moral corruption that needed to be purged with fire. The victims of the pyre were not a single group. They were anyone who stood outside the rigid social, political, and religious norms of the time. They were the dissenters, the outsiders, the inconvenient, and the feared. Burning at the stake has a power over our imagination that other historical forms of execution do not. We know about beheading, hanging, and drawing, and quartering, but burning holds a special, dark place. Why does this particular method of death resonate so strongly centuries after it fell out of use? The answer lies in its primal symbolism, its public nature, and what it represents about the human capacity for cruelty in the name of righteousness. Fire itself is a primal force. It is deeply embedded in the human psyche. It is the source of warmth and light, a tool for cooking and industry. But it is also a force of absolute terrifying destruction. It consumes everything, leaving nothing behind. The idea of being consciously consumed by this element taps into a deep, visceral fear. It is a slow, agonizing, and sensory-rich death. The visual of the flames, the smell of the smoke and burning flesh, the sounds of the crowd and the victim. It is a complete assault on the senses, making it incredibly potent for storytelling, art, and memory. Paintings of martyrs, books about the Inquisition, and movies about witch hunts all return to this central, horrifying image. The practice was also an act of theater. It was designed to be remembered. The procession through the streets, the religious sermons, the public gathering, the slow, deliberate building of the pyre, it was all a performance of power. The state and the church were putting on a show for the public, and the message was unambiguous. This is what happens to those who defy us. It was a form of brutal, state-sanctioned terrorism designed to enforce conformity through fear. Because it was so public and so memorable, its story was passed down through generations, becoming a part of the cultural folklore of Europe. More than anything, burning at the stake has become the ultimate symbol of religious intolerance and fanaticism. It represents the idea of killing someone not for what they did, but for what they thought or believed. It is the physical manifestation of an authority so certain of its own truth that it is willing to inflict unspeakable suffering on those who disagree. This is why the image is still so powerful today. When we talk about a modern witch hunt, we are invoking the memory of a time when accusations, paranoia, and a rigid ideology led to real people being burned. The stake stands as a permanent monument to the dangers of dogmatism and the abuse of power in the name of a higher cause. The practice did not end with the Middle Ages. It continued well into the early modern period, through the Reformation and the great witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries. Catholics burned Protestants, and Protestants burned Catholics. Both burned Anabaptists and supposed witches. It slowly faded away with the rise of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, as ideas about human rights, reason, and the rejection of cruel and unusual punishment took hold. The last official burning at the stake in Europe took place in the late 1700s, but its legacy is burned into our history. It serves as a stark reminder that the worst atrocities are often not committed by monsters in the dark, but by ordinary people who are convinced they are doing God's work in the light of day. It was a systematic, legally justified process carried out by priests, judges, and officials who believed they were purifying the world. They were not just killing a body, they were trying to kill an idea. And the enduring horror of the burning stake is the chilling realization that they were willing to use the most painful, terrifying death imaginable to do it. The memory of the flames warns us of what can happen when absolute certainty meets absolute power.